Okay, good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Again, thank you for joining us on the Washington Policy Pulse. We're going to be talking about tariffs plus a little bit of what is going on this week. Joining me is Maeva Cousin, one of our Bloomberg economics analysts. She's doing a lot of the great research on what is happening with Trump's tariffs and what it means for the global economy. Also, if you've been on this call before, you know Holly Frum. She is one of our analysts that covers litigation and policy, and she spent a good portion of yesterday updating the report that we have. It's a fairly long report at this point. I think we're talking about 20 sectors, and so it's only on terminal at the moment. But if you do have any point of, you want to have access to that research, obviously you can ping me, Holly, Maeva, and we will make sure to get that to you, all of our research. So let's go ahead and talk about tariffs. So where we are at the moment is, President Trump has declared a 25% tariff on all goods from Canada and Mexico, 10% on Canadian energy, and then has also at the same point had a 10% tariff on China. Right now, we had a couple of statements from President Trump this morning, again, digging in on this. He said that he had a conversation with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and that they are going to speak again at 3 p.m. Eastern this afternoon. And also, if you read the Truth Social statements and you look at it, a lot of it is geared towards fentanyl and immigration, not so much the arguments about the economy at the moment. So I just want to say that, there is a lot of discussion of will they move forward or will they not move forward with these tariffs. Remember, they go into fruition at 12:01 tonight or tomorrow morning. But again, it's President Trump's call. I mean, there's not a lot of what we can say here in terms of will these move forward or not. But markets, investors, and companies certainly need to be prepared because President Trump definitely means what he means here. And, I don't think that if we were to have this call tomorrow, certainly I think President Trump would be more than, willing to follow through on that threat, depending on what that happens at 3 o'clock today. Now, a lot of clients have been asking me of what should we be looking for in terms of how to see what pressure would be on President Trump to try and dial away from these tariffs, namely pressure on the Republican Party. And this is the problem or opportunity, if you will, with tariffs at the moment within the Republican Party, is that you have a significant chunk of the Republican Party who's pro-tariff. You have a significant chunk of the Republican Party that's anti-tariff. And those two parts of the party are continuing to butt heads. But neither side has a majority to the point where they could potentially try and put influence on the president or at least have a congressional action on this. And so as a result, it remains President Trump's power. And remember, if you've been on this call before, you know that we've talked a lot about how the power of the presidency is more powerful here. Holly's going to talk a little bit about specifically what he did in this space, but President Trump could certainly move forward with it. What I'm looking, though, to see is if there's any resolution or any type of pressure to be pushing people to dial back on these tariffs. It's going to come from the trade associations, not so much the U.S. Chamber, but I think a lot of these farmer-related, national manufacturer-related, fertilizer-related trade associations that you normally don't hear about all that much, but they have significant allies up on Capitol Hill. And so if Canada were to just theoretically put a 25% export tax on potash, for example, something that most Americans I don't think understand what potash is, but 90% of the U.S. fertilizer industry relies on potash. And if you're a farmer in a Trump-led state and you see your potash prices increase, you're certainly going to voice a disapproval with that. And who are you going to voice that disapproval to? Your local state and representative and your individual in Congress. So with that being said, Maeva, I want to turn it over to you. Can you give us your thoughts? I just saw you quoted in an article this morning talking about the impact that these tariffs could have on U.S. GDP, and I think that'd be great, something that our clients would love to learn more about.
Hi, thanks a lot, Nathan. So we covered over the weekend this announcement that President Donald Trump was going to put 25% tariff on Mexico, Canada, 10% on Canadian energy, 10% on China, additional 10% on China. It's a huge move. It's a very, very sizable increase in U.S. average effective tariff. It would take average effective tariff from just under 3% now to close to 11%. So I'm talking about the average tariff rate paid on all U.S. goods imports, because this move is actually targeting 43 or affecting 43% of all U.S. imports based on 2023 numbers. So it would take the average effective tariff from the U.S. back to the 60s, to the 1960s, and it is probably about more than 4 to 5 times the size of the shock of the first trade war with China. So we are talking about a very, very substantial move in tariffs we've looked into the implications it could have in the short term for the U.S. economy, and this was especially what it could mean for the Fed, because the Fed will be looking at this very dramatic change in U.S. trade relationship with its three largest partners and wondering what that means for their next policy moves. And so what we've done is that we've looked at some 2018 estimates by the Fed of what an increase in tariff could mean for the U.S. economy. And what we found is that based on their estimates, if you increase the average effective rate on all tariffs by 8 percentage points, it could mean that it could be a 1.2% shock to GDP, negative shock to GDP, and plus 0.7% shock on inflation, on PCE. So it is clearly a stagflationary shock that will be quite difficult for the Fed to handle if it happens along those lines, because they will have to take into account both the upside risk to inflation, and after the scare of the 2022 second round effect, wage spiral, I think they will be quite worried about these upside risks to inflation, but at the same time downside risk to activity. Very quickly, if you want, of course, for Mexico and Canada, it is a major challenge. Mexico and Canada export respectively 26% worth of their GDP and 21% worth of their GDP to the US. Even if you strip out all the intermediate inputs that go into those, like the foreign content, it's still 16% of Mexican GDP and 14% of Canadian GDP that are directly exported to the US, directly exposed to those exports. And we have a very large-scale model of the global economy where we've looked at the long-term impact or medium-term impact of those tariffs. They could result in a 70% drop in Mexican exports to the US. So it has a lot at stake. For Mexico, 60% drop in Canadian exports. For China, of course, the impact is more limited. The increase is not as large. China has already been moving away from the US as a source of demand following the first trade war, and they are a much bigger economy, much less exposed uniquely to the US. So the impact would be a lot more manageable. We've seen the market movements, dollar appreciating, peso depreciating. Of course, there will be some some of the shock will be absorbed through exchange rate changes, but just a reminder that not all the shock will be absorbed, because there are a lot of moving parts, and only part of the shock can be absorbed through exchange rates. Some of the shock will have to happen through actual price increases for US or cost push increases for US importers.
Great, thank you very much. And just as a reminder, folks, remember you can always put questions into the chat function, and we can certainly get that to you today. We don't want this call to go too long because look, the markets are now open. So, Holly, can you give us your thoughts on your report that you put out yesterday? Talk about some of the legalities of these tariffs as well, and any other insights that you could have for the crew that's listening.
Sure. Thank you, Nathan. So, yep, Trump signed these executive orders yesterday imposing tariffs on China, Canada, and Mexico to take effect tomorrow, February 4th. And he based the tariffs on his declaration of emergency under the International Economic Powers Act. The emergency he cited is illicit drug trafficking and illicit immigration. The law has never been used before in this manner. It's been used before, for example, to impose blanket bans on exports and imports from countries not or violating U.S. policy, for example, like humanitarian rights and things like that, or on members of certain governments, like members of the government of Sudan, for example, but never a certain percentage on goods. So this will most likely be challenged, and it remains to be seen what the courts will do and if they'll find them justified based on the emergency he cited. But I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about Section 301 tariffs the Trump administration imposed in 2018. And so during his first administration in 2017, Trump tasked his U.S. trade rep with investigating whether countries were honoring trade agreements, specifically China. And the U.S. trade rep found that China was not honoring trade agreements with respect to U.S. intellectual property. So based on that recommendation, Trump imposed $50 billion worth of tariffs on Chinese goods. And China came back, retaliated, and they went back and forth like this until the U.S. had imposed tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods. And challengers filed a lawsuit in the U.S. International Trade Court saying that the subsequent tariffs were done in retaliation to China's retaliation. They were not done to address the U.S. intellectual property problem that Trump cited in his first, as the basis for his first round of tariffs. And so they said Trump is acting without statutory authority because Section 301 allows Trump to address countries not on any trade agreements, but the subsequent tariffs weren't related to that. They were related to retaliation. They were the basis for it was retaliation. We expect a similar challenge will be raised here, that the emergency is a pretext for just wanting to impose tariffs, and that the 10 to 25% tariff, there's no explanation as to how that will solve the problem he cited as the emergency, illicit drugs and immigration. But the courts in the hearing the Section 301 challenges found that the subsequent tariffs were related to the original purpose, which was to address the intellectual property issue. We think the court may find something similar here. And courts have been very reluctant to intervene in the tariff space, and also separately presidential declarations of emergency. And that's why we've said, though these tariffs have never, something like this has never happened before, so we don't have much legal precedent. The precedent we do have suggests that they will be upheld.
Great, thank you. And we do have a question in the chat. This question was, does this round of tariffs defy predictions that the administration would avoid those that might directly or immediately affect consumers, Trump coalition voters, due to political risk? And if so, what do you expect the midterm implications to be, both economically and politically? And I'll take the political aspect. I'll say I was a little surprised. I honestly thought that there would be a little bit more negotiations that took place. Look, they're still taking place, and there is a chance that these tariffs, if they do happen, they're very short-lived, because I think, like I said earlier before, President Trump right now is focusing on fentanyl and border security, and those are two areas that the Canadian and Mexican governments can sort of negotiate with Trump on more, rather than the economic trade balances and so forth like that. But I will say is that President Trump had vowed on this. This is what he campaigned on, and remember, because he won the popular vote, he does believe that he has a mandate. And so when he is going to be a lame duck fairly soon, I mean, look, all second-term presidents become a lame duck at a certain point. But when you look at what he has the power to do versus what he has to rely on Congress to do, this is one of those things that he has the power to do. And I certainly think that he's trying to push that momentum. So I don't know, Maeve or Holly, if you had a question or if any thoughts on the economic, what the midterm implications would be on this.
So I think that's, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think that's it's really true that the modus operandi is clearly very different from what we've seen in the first trade war, or the first administration and then the first trade war, where indeed they were targeting capital goods, intermediate goods, for which they knew that especially the pass-through to consumer prices should be more limited than when you start targeting consumer goods. I think the inflation question is probably an important one, because I think President Trump is aware that inflation was probably one of the reasons that helped him into this 2024 election. So it's probably something he's going to be probably quite careful about. So inflation is probably one thing to watch. And the retaliation from partners will be interesting, because we have seen the first list from Canada, and Canada seems to have drafted this list or picked this list quite carefully to make sure that they maximize the political power of that list. So it's something to watch. We are going to do more work now on the retaliation from Canada and see whether we think it's actually, clearly they don't have the same firepower than the US, but how they have picked the specific products would be interesting.
Great. We've got another question. How severely does the market have to respond to Scott Bessent, President Trump, other secretaries to change course? To the extent that that's part of their reaction function, what are the indicators to watch there? Obviously, this is where you've heard me say before, the soap opera portion of the White House, where you have the Howard Lutniks, the Jameson Greer. Jameson Greer has a confirmation hearing on Thursday. That will be certainly interesting. He's the nominee to be the U.S. Trade Representative. But then at the other side, you have Scott Bessent, who's called for this, small escalating tariff, 2.5% growing and so forth. I don't think it's going to come from the cabinet secretaries. I think it has to come from the market. And I think it has to come from maybe some of these congressional allies. But right now, the congressional allies aren't really talking about this. I've often said that President Trump views the market and specifically the Dow Jones as an indicator of how the economy is going. When he wakes up in the morning, he turns on Fox News and they have that little indicator. Now, I wish he was turning on Bloomberg News, but he has that little indicator there that says, is this in the green or is this in the red? And, I certainly think that's something that he's going to be paying attention to. But, he's also got on his schedule this week to talk to JP Morgan's Jamie Dimon about this. So I think this is just part of President Trump's, mantra is he puts out his statement, he puts out his plan, and then he just talks to people and he's going to say, hey, how do you think it's going? How do you think it's going? And that's why I think that, he'll continue to do that as things move forward and as this goes forward, just because, he does like to keep a pulse on what is happening here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk a little bit more about just random stuff that's happening here in Washington. But again, if you have any other questions, please feel free to put that in the chat. Oh, I see one more in the Q&A. What is necessary? Oops, sorry, 1 second. Oh, well, question was, why does Donald Trump talk about acquiring a sovereign country like Canada as the 51st state? I think that's just President Trump politically, playing around on Truth Social. So when it comes to Washington, a couple other things to keep in mind this week. You're seeing lots of press reports right now of the DOGE committee and what they're doing. It was reported over the weekend that DOGE has accessed the U.S. Department of Treasury's payment systems. They currently have closed the USAID, actually the headquarters here in Washington. It was reported that USAID employees were told not to come to work today. What I would just say is that this is quickly heading towards the courts. This goes back to the idea of impoundment, whether this is the idea that when President Trump can decide to not spend the money that Congress has probably already allocated. Remember, because Congress is the ones that set the power of the purse, they have the power of appropriations, and if they say, and I'm just making this up, you have to spend $100 billion in the Department of Education, and Trump just says no, somebody's going to sue over that. And so this is quickly going to go to the courts, and if you listen to Elon Musk's Doge comments, if you will, on X last night, he even said that he's going to need the support from the courts on certain things. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot that the DOGE committee can do, and there's a lot of regulatory red tape that needs to be cut in the U.S. government, but this is quickly heading to the courts, so just keep that in mind. A lot of confirmation hearings and votes we have this week: Tulsi Gabbard, RFK Jr., Kash Patel, Howard Lutnick, Chris Wright. It's our belief, continue to believe, that Tulsi Gabbard would be the one that potentially would not get through if it were to take place. Remember, the Senate Intelligence Committee, their vote is behind closed doors, so there's a little bit less pressure on the Republicans than if those that are in the public sector. But, in terms of confirmation hearings, most important to us is, like I just mentioned, the Jamison Greer U.S. Trade Representative on Thursday. I'll be watching that. Holly will probably be staying attuned to that. So if you have any questions on that hearing, just feel free to ping us. Also, what's going on is the House Budget Committee is meeting to come up with their reconciliation instructions. This is how they have to create the instructions before they move forward on developing what is the reconciliation plan. And the challenge here is the House Budget Committee has to figure out how much money they want to add to the deficit through this program. And if you remember, the Republican Study Committee has already said that they're not going to support anything unless it decreases the deficit. So this is just a challenge. I don't think the House Budget Committee is going to be able to get through this within this week. We've always said before that until there's actually a true deadline, and in this case it'd be December 31st for those tax extensions, they can always kick the can. So, we'll see what happens, but I think the House Budget Committee is going to struggle with that. And then finally, a little bit more fun news. The House is actually going to mark up legislation to keep AM radio in the United States. There's actually been an effort to do away with it, and so there's going to be legislation to keep that in mind. So with that, I'm going to pause there, say thank you very much. Tomorrow at 9 a.m. Eastern, Holly and I are going to be moderating a larger webinar on tariffs where we're going to bring in probably about 13, I think, analysts from across PI, and we're going to go from automakers to retail to apparel. I was going to say retail apparel, clothing, Lululemon. I was at Lululemon yesterday with my daughter. We're going to go through sector by sector by sector, and we're going to talk about what these tariffs mean. So if you want access to that, please feel free to reach out to me. We don't have I think we're just putting the invite out for it now, so also keep an eye on it on my LinkedIn. But Holly and Maeva, thank you very much for attending today. Thank you to our guests for attending today, and I wish you a great day. Thank you.